everybody. I hope this is going to work out. And we kind of had some issues, but hopefully, if nothing else, you'll hear us just fine. And it's time for another Convos with Kim. So here is Kim. Hello. So today I'm going to talk about arbitrary lines and how they are drawn. And I was just have been thinking a lot lately about how we as humans in our societies are going to have to get a lot more flexible in our thinking because as Connie talks about a lot on here, things are changing rapidly. Suddenly, many more things are possible because of technology, and that's just only going to increase more and more and get faster and faster. And we need to be able to create new rules around those new possibilities. We can't just be set in stone and think that life is going to go on or should go on the way it always has, because that never has been the case. So it's always funny to me that some people always kind of want this to go back to the good old days or whatever. But the fact is that humans progress and life progresses on, and we need to be able to do that also. And it's funny that the times we want to go back to never even existed in the first
Yeah,
place in the way we now perceive them.
yeah, exactly. Like I always say, if you could choose what time you wanted to go back to, what would that be? And then if you actually think about what daily life or life in general was like during that time, most of the time we wouldn't actually choose to go back there, but some people seem to always just think they want to. So if you are that kind of person, just that black and white and rigid in your thinking, you're going to be constantly frustrated and left behind, just like that kind of person has been all throughout history. So just for some examples, like suddenly it's no longer clear what is human generated and what is machine generated. A lot of the machine generated stuff, even though some people don't want to admit it, but it is as good as human generated stuff. The machine generated music, if you weren't told ahead of time that it was machine generated, a lot of times you would have no idea. Or the same for like the books are getting to be machine computer generated now. And so yeah, we're just going to have to think about a lot of new things that we didn't have to think about before. Like, does AI have the right to use copyrighted material without permission? And that's just going to get more and more difficult. Like AI is going to be copying different personalities and whatever. And do they have the right, like, to copy your personality without your permission? But in a way, how could you stop it? Because there's no proof that they're copying your particular personality. And but like movie actors, do they have the can people should they have the right to just be able to download a pretend movie actor who looks like this certain person and communicates with you like that person would? There's just all kinds of new rules around that we're going to have to be thinking about. Or like self-driving cars. If a self-driving car causes an accident, who pays for that accident? The owner of the car, like it always has been throughout time. Is if you're in an accident and you own the car, then you are responsible for it. But should that continue to be the case? Or should it be the creator of the software that was actually driving the car? Should they be the ones that are responsible for paying for the accident that their software caused? Just tons of ethical questions like that. So we can bury our heads in the sand and say, well, of course, there's no obvious difference between a human and a computer. I mean, of course, the differences between humans and computers are obvious. That's scientific fact. I mean, computers are not flesh and blood like human beings are. That's science. There are obviously material differences between humans and machines. But so what? I mean, you can stick to your science and say that this should all just be so obvious and easy, but pointing out those scientific facts aren't going to help us in our rapidly changing world, because like I said, computers are just going to have more and more capabilities and look more and more human as far as what they can do all the time. So there aren't black and white, obvious, right or wrong answers. There's only our current situation and the humans alive during that situation who have to make the rules. So you can call that situational ethics. And when I was growing up, the people I was growing up with just thought situational ethics were horrible. They thought, well, if you're just basing your ethics, your moral code on whatever situation you're in, that just means you're fickle and you're just conveniently changing the rules for whatever situation. But that's not really what it means. I mean, it means that you still have like overarching principles that you try to stick to, but the way you apply those principles in each situation is going to be different. Like you can say that, what?
I was just gonna say, I think everybody does this too, even though they might not even realize it or admit it or whatever, but everybody just always does use situational ethics depending on what they believe like is right in a certain situation or what they might do when they're by themselves versus when they're with other people or admit to or whatever.
Right. Or even like raising kids, which can be very tricky, especially if you have kids that are like close together in age. You might, in principle, want to raise them just the same and fairly and whatever, but in particular situations, if one of them has a handicap or just different problems or whatever, you can't like treat them exactly the same. In fact, that would be harmful if you tried to treat both of your kids exactly the same. The ideal would be to raise each child according to that child's needs and according to how all the needs fit together in the family. So yeah, we have to make those rules all the time. And a lot of times we do it subconsciously, like Connie said, but then when we stop to think about it, we think, oh no, my rules are always the same. They never change. But in reality, they do, and they have to. So I think actually this rigid thinking is a cause of a lot more harm than supposedly ever-changing situational ethics. I mean, especially now, the faster our world moves, the faster we're going to have to be able to think and adapt. And of course, while we do that, we rely on all kinds of things. Like, well, of course, we do rely on science, what science tells us and what the facts are, what history tells us, what our experience and our hearts and minds tell us. There's a lot of things that we rely on to help us make those decisions, not just supposedly black and white scientific facts. We have to make sure we're considering all the relevant facts. So, for example, some couple of the examples here I'm gonna use might be upsetting, but it's just things that we have to think about in this new world, whether we want to or not. People might say that obviously there's only two genders. That's science. There's a male gender and a female gender. We cannot go beyond this binary of two. Transgender doesn't exist because there are no physical markers of a transgender person. It's just all in their heads. If you have a Y chromosome in certain body parts, you're obviously a male, period. That type of person just can't imagine that there might be other factors involved and other reasons and ways to draw the lines between male and female more fluidly, like we do all the time in other cases. We could choose to use other markers like testosterone levels, or just decide that the line between male and female doesn't need to be so rigid. We could just decide as a society not to make what is already a hard, agonizing decision and process to have to go through even harder, because in our rapidly changing world, it's possible and getting easier by the day to change genders. So we are no longer bound by rigid scientific facts. We have choices about those different which facts to look at, such as, like I mentioned, testosterone levels are just in the brain. We can do brain imaging and see that one person's brain, they might be more left-brained or right-brained, or just their brain might be more what is traditionally the opposite gender of what they physically are. There's just all kinds of things we should consider and have the ability to consider now.
And even if your personal opinion might be different, like if you're just going to refuse, I mean, if you're just going to say there's only two genders and that's all, I mean, you still have to cooperate in a society that has like drawn different conclusions. So we still have to figure out how to get along with and be not only tolerant, but like compassionate of other people that do things differently than the choices you might make.
Yeah, because the fact is, the possibility to change gender exists now, and people are going to want to take advantage of those new possibilities. We can't just put our head in the sand and pretend it's not happening or that it shouldn't happen, just like we can't pretend AI doesn't exist. It does, and it's changing our world. So people, in trying to make these decisions, I think the wrong way to go about it is what some people do. They have these rigid lines that they think nature has drawn and they're always talking about what is natural, what is the natural right thing to do or unnatural according to them. Of course, they used to say the same thing about gay people. Well, it's obvious that God gave us certain body parts which are obviously designed to be used in this one particular way. But as we progressed and became more tolerant and learned more, we realized that there don't need to be rigid lines between what we're not allowed to do with our body. So since we've realized that, finally, it took way longer than it should have, but now we no longer arrest people for being gay like we used to in the 1960s. I think there are even some cases in the 1970s of people literally being drug out of their houses and arrested for being gay. So we should all be thankful that we have progressed beyond that point.
Yeah, I mean, I know somebody that was beaten up for being gay just like 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, I'm sure it still even happens. And another thing that occurred to me too is this whole silly argument about what's natural, like the same people that say like gay being homosexual isn't natural, it's just obvious, but yet those same people don't hesitate to use like birth control, which isn't natural either. So like, yeah, people just say whatever they wanted, they justify their own beliefs without even really thinking about like applying it to themselves too.
Like, yeah, what does natural even mean? I mean, literally anything a human can do is natural. If a person can jump up 10 feet in the air, that's natural to be able to do for them. Or like substances, they're always trying to say which substances are natural. And I mean, humans have messed with chemicals and substances all throughout. So technically it's all like natural because it exists and we are able to use it. But we just have to, like I said, that's just another area where we have to be able to make decisions logically and not just with these supposedly rigid terms. Because most people don't just decide these things willy-nilly. They don't just decide to be gay, or they don't just decide to start taking life-changing medications or hormones, or to change their life dramatically and cross these lines, do the hard societal work to cross these lines. Usually the people who make these decisions have thought long and hard about it, and they're doing it. They're crossing those lines because it's necessary for them in their own to stay mentally healthy or physically healthy or whatever. So we used to say things like depression, ADHD, autism didn't exist because we could look at the person and not see anything physically wrong with that person. So we'd say, oh, you don't need that pill for your depression. It's all just in your head. Just snap out of it. There's nothing wrong with you. Or for autism, where it's common for kids to have meltdowns because they get overwhelmed. we'd say, why don't those parents just discipline their child, learn to take better care of their child and discipline it better? But now, thanks to science and psychology and the study of the brain, we realize that there's more going on in there than is visible. Like something is actually happening in the child that is causing these meltdowns to happen. They're happening for a reason. Or this depression is caused by a lack of serotonin. Or, of course, there are different ways to, is it serotonin or serotonin? I always get mixed up because my screensaver says it the wrong way, so I never know. But anyway, of course, there are different ways to handle these things, and we can't just become like totally dependent on medication or allow our kids to have meltdowns all the time. But it's just that thanks to these diagnoses and more understanding of what's going on beneath the surface, we now have a direction that we can go in dealing with the problem. So we can like get special help in training in school if we know that our child is autistic. Yeah, it's just interesting to me. Like now it seems like many kids, you hear all the time about so-and-so's child being autistic, or somebody realizing as an adult that they have like autistic characteristics or whatever. And so, I mean, you could be skeptical of that, and sometimes I am, and sometimes I'm not, but it's just that the more information we have, the more humans are going to deal with that information, and it's just going to come up because it's out there in the world now. So we have to deal with it, and the vast majority of the time, it's very positive and good that we have ways of making these diagnoses. But what exactly are these diagnoses? They are made by humans, doctors, who, after studying a lot of these cases, make the decision and draw the lines as to what should represent an autism diagnosis or a depression diagnosis. They look at your hormone levels and give you all kinds of tests and ask you all kinds of questions. And then the doctor draws the line to tell you when you are depressed or overweight, or when you have high blood pressure. These lines haven't always existed for all time. They weren't handed down to us by a god. They are lines drawn by humans based on their best medical knowledge at the time. Sometimes the lines need to be adjusted, like the high blood pressure. I was just reading recently that they are realizing that they kind of overdiagnosed high blood pressure when maybe it actually is healthy for some people's blood pressure to be a little bit higher. Maybe that's good for them. So they kind of had to raise that line and change that diagnosis of what actually constitutes high blood pressure, or they just had to realize that maybe in this situation for this person, the high blood pressure isn't as much of a concern or whatever. So other lines are drawn because society demands it. Like, who draws the line when someone becomes an adult? There's no physical marker, like a red dot doesn't suddenly appear on your forehead when you turn 18 to show that you're an adult now. We just decided that relatively recently. It wasn't so long ago that children had adult jobs. They worked out in the fields or down in the coal mines and got married at age 15 or 16 or younger. But then we invented better technology and didn't need kids to work out in the fields anymore. So we invented the concept of high school, which was basically just to keep teenagers occupied because we didn't need them working. There was like an oversupply of workers. So that's why we decided to send teenagers to high school. And of course, a better educated society is always a good thing, but it was humans who talked about and agreed upon a legal age when you became an adult, or when you can be sent off to war. Like ironically, now we made some adjustments to that and arbitrarily decided that the drinking age should be 21. because experience taught us that younger kids just couldn't be trusted to handle the alcohol or the responsibility of alcohol. So yeah, it doesn't really make much sense now the way that turned out, that we can send an 18-year-old kid off to war, off to die for his country at age 18. We can hand them guns at age 18 and tell them to go out and kill the enemy, but we can't trust them with a drink. So that's because humans drew the lines, and humans are often silly and contradictory. And that's why we need to be willing to change these lines. Because, like I said, they aren't handed down to us from on high. We should just always be willing to change things to make them better. Like I've talked about before, this reverence that some people have for our Constitution. And I mean, for a country's Constitution, it turned out pretty good, and it has like stood us well for the last 250 years. But the fact is that it was made 250 years ago, just about, by white land owning males. They pretty much made it for their benefit. So now we need to be willing, and I think more and more we're going to need to have to change our Constitution, like to fit the modern situations and do things to it so that it can be changed faster. And I'm going to take a drink here for a second.
But it's funny that yeah, like they make it so complicated to be able to change it. And so instead what happens is it just kind of gets ignored, or like it could even just amendment or anything is next to impossible to enforce. So they just kind of put other laws on top of it. So then, I mean, why even, yeah, I mean,
It's
either,
crazy sometimes the way the Supreme Court just messes with the language of the Constitution to try to make it fit whatever law they want to make. And sometimes it's just absurd. I mean, it just makes no sense of what they've done to try to make the Constitution fit the law. Why don't they just update the Constitution so they don't have to go through such a rigmarole?
like with the Bible, some people find a way to, they have to back up whatever decision they make or whatever they want to do with a Bible verse, and then they ignore other ones that like say the opposite or whatever.
Yep, they'll just take verses out of context or twist them beyond all recognition to try to make it just so they can have God's backing on whatever they want to do, basically. Another area where humans draw the line for what should be like the speed limit or the alcohol limit. Men decided that having only one black ancestor makes a person black, and therefore you can be enslaved. That was decided like 250 years ago, how much black blood you could have in your genetic line in order for you to qualify as a black person so that they could enslave you. So your father could be white, but if your mother was black, or your grandmother or your great-grandmother, anybody back there in your bloodline, if that person was black, you could be enslaved, even if your skin was physically white. So that's a case of where the obvious physical markers were conveniently ignored. As that, in that situation, they wanted to be all scientific and look at your bloodline. And another arbitrary thing they decided back then was the Dred Scott decision, which was a Supreme Court decision where it was decided that only 3/5 of enslaved people should be counted in the census, because it was feared that if you counted all the slaves, then the South would always get a lot more votes on any thing that came up. They would have a lot more representation and get more votes than the North. So they decided that black people basically should only count as 3/5 of a person. And of course, that didn't have any backing in science. That was just arbitrarily decided by humans. Another argument you hear from some people today is that abortion should not be allowed because a person is a person, no matter how small. You hear that all the time today from this Dr. Seuss book. Now they use it in their argument. But in our rapidly changing world, it became easier and more possible for people to get an abortion. Now, a lot of abortions can be done just by taking a simple pill. So, of course, people are going to be taking advantage of that new technology and these new possibilities, just like they took advantage of the birth control pill when that came out. Once something becomes available, there's no holding back the humans who want to make use of that new thing. And
Or
of course,
fertility treatments, like most people wouldn't say that. I mean, people aren't allowed to do that, but yet that means then there's a lot of extra like fertilized eggs that never get used, but there's not a public outcry against that. It's just kind of arbitrary.
yep, just whoever decides to make a big deal out of something, usually a powerful politician, is able to make some dumb argument, and then people, without thinking anything through for themselves, they just kind of go along with that, whatever stance their party takes or whatever. And of course, there were the naysayers, like on this birth control pill. There were naysayers, like there always are, saying motherhood is a woman's God-given duty. What woman in her right mind would want to take birth control and stop her God-given purpose of having children? It's obvious that nature intended women to have babies. Women shouldn't be taking this foreign substance to stop this natural process. We can't let women become so irresponsible with their bodies. It'll be the downfall of society if women think they can get away with not having kids whenever they want to. Then they'll just go out and start having all this free sex, and they just won't be responsible at all, and the whole world will fall apart. And then, of course, a lot of those same arguments were made against abortion. And if you try to say, well, at the beginning, it's just a clump of cells that doesn't feel pain and won't experience any harm if it isn't allowed to be born, then they'll say, but scientifically, those cells are destined to become a baby. We shouldn't stop what God intended those cells to be. And then they'll go on to use this arbitrary line argument. Are you going to say something?
Uh-uh.
Okay, then they'll say about the arbitrary lines, they'll say, yeah, but where's the line? Does it suddenly become a baby at 12 weeks or at 22 weeks? No, there is no line when it suddenly becomes a baby, just like there's no magic number when you suddenly become overweight, or a magic line when you suddenly become an adult. It's something that humans agreed on for societal reasons or health reasons. Abortion at 26 weeks is just an arbitrary line that society agreed on because scientists agree that after that point, the fetus is likely to feel pain. And yet, if we get too rigid about even that line and say no abortion whatsoever after 26 weeks, then horrific things can happen, like women being forced to carry a fetus that has died, or one that will die in agony shortly after birth. So I think it's just rigidity that causes a lot of these problems when there needs to be allowances for, and looking at each individual situation and being willing to move these lines around. Like Connie has told the story on here before about the officials who wanted her and I to go to the North Dakota School for the Blind instead of the South Dakota School for the Blind, because we were just a few miles over the border. So they wanted us to go to school in North Dakota when that school was 400 miles away from where we lived. But the one in South Dakota was only 200 miles away from where we lived. But there were some rigid people that said a border is a border, and you have crossed this arbitrary line that we have drawn that is now like the gospel truth, and you have to go to school in whatever state you are legally in. But thankfully, so in that case, it was just humans being silly and stupid about a line that needed to be more flexible.
But the governor of South Dakota at that time, Bill Janklow, was willing, thankfully, to step in and use some common sense and say that no, in this case, we should be able to be more flexible with that line. And these girls should be able to go to school here in South Dakota because it's only half as far and they aren't that far over the border. And yeah, it's just common sense. So every now and then, common sense does prevail, which is a good thing. Societies work together to come up with these lines precisely because the lines don't physically or scientifically exist in nature. We are continually making the lines using logic and science and hopefully common sense. The end.
Yay. And I just got a notification saying running out of time, so I'm not sure when it. So yeah, I guess we'll draw that to a close, and I think that was a good lesson. So be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Okay.